We were 2 days into the Beartooths when the weather decided we weren't welcome. The trip was my idea. It usually was. I found a route that linked 3 lake basins along the eastern plateau. Nothing technical, just 60 miles of trail above the tree line with views into Wyoming. I've been planning it since June. Topo maps spread across the kitchen table, elevation profiles taped to the fridge, weather windows circled in red on the calendar like birthdays. October was the window. The crowds were gone, the snow hadn't set in yet, and the aspens in the valleys below would be turning. I sold it to Mike and Scott as the last trip before winter shut everything down. Mike is my brother-in-law. He married my sister 11 years ago, and I've spent more nights in a tent with him than she probably likes. He's a careful hiker, checks the straps on his pack twice, keeps his water bottles in the same pockets every time, tapes his heels before the first blister forms. You want Mike on a trip because he's never the reason something goes wrong. Scott I've known since college. He was my roommate for 2 years, and the best man had a wedding that didn't take. We don't talk about that. What we do is this. 1 trip a year, sometimes 2, always somewhere that requires effort to reach. Scott is the strongest hiker of the 3 of us, but you wouldn't know it from how he carries himself. He doesn't lead unless you ask him to, fills the gaps that other people leave. If the campsite needs water, Scott's already walking to the creek. If someone's pack is riding wrong, Scott notices before they do. He's the person whose absence you feel before you understand what is missing. Day 1 was perfect. Blue sky, cold air, the trail switchbacking up through the last of the pines before opening onto the plateau. We made good time, camped at the first lake basin with the peaks catching the last of the light. An evening that justifies every mile of planning. Day 2 started fine. Colder, with clouds building from the northwest, but the forecast had them sliding south. We packed up, hit the trail by 7, and climbed toward the pass that connected the first basin to the second. By 10, the clouds hadn't slid south. Settled. By 11, the wind had picked up enough to make conversation difficult. By noon, the first snow came sideways across the plateau, and I couldn't see the trail markers anymore. A whiteout at elevation is not like a snowstorm in a city. There's no trees if you're above the tree line. The ground and the sky become the same thing, a white blank that swallows depth perception. You can't tell if the ground ahead of you is flat or falling away. You walk with your arms out, and you trust the compass because your eyes are useless. I'd planned for bad weather. Part of planning a route is figuring out the bailouts. I had 3 marked on my topo map. The closest was a cabin, a small square on an old USGS survey sheet, sitting in a clearing 2 miles northeast of the pass. I looked it up online and found nothing, just the square on the map. We turned northeast and walked on a bearing. It took 2 hours to cover 2 miles. The terrain dropped into scattered pines, which broke the wind, but the snow was knee-deep in the sheltered spots. I almost walked past it. The cabin was a dark shape with no edges in the whiteout. But there it was. Single-story log structure, pitched roof under fresh snow, a door, 2 shuttered windows, a stovepipe. The door was unlocked. Not too unusual for the scenario we found ourselves in. We went inside. 1 room, a wood stove against the left wall, a stack of split firewood, neatly arranged, a table with 2 chairs, 2 bunks built into the right wall, one above the other, a logbook on the table with a pencil beside it, and on the far wall, opposite the door we'd come through, a second door, nailed shut, 6 nails driven through the frame, sunk deep, heads flush with the grain. 2 bunks, 3 of us. "I'll take the floor," Scott said, already shrugging off his pack. This is what Scott does. He solves the problem before it becomes one, by absorbing the cost himself, so fast and naturally that refusing feels like an insult. I've watched him do it for 15 years, drive 7 hours so everyone else can sleep, carry the heavier pack, take the bad tent site. He means it every time, which is almost worse than selfishness, because you can't argue with someone who genuinely doesn't mind. Mike and I took the bunks. I took the top. Scott laid his padding back on the floor near the stove. The firewood was dry, recently split, the cuts fresh enough to smell of pine sap. The stove had been swept. Someone was maintaining this cabin, restocking the wood, cleaning the stove. But there was no signage, no agency markers, no registration tag. Every Forest Service cabin I've used had a tag, a number, rules nailed to the wall. This had nothing. I opened the logbook while Mike got the fire started. Names, dates, brief notes, standard shelter register. The entries went back years. The recent entries were different. The last page had 3 entries spaced weeks apart. No names. The first said, "Don't open it." The second, "Close." The third, in different ink but a hand I couldn't distinguish from the second, "Shut." They could have meant anything. Close the flue, shut the door when you leave. I was cold and tired. The stove was crackling and the warmth was coming. The heat went up, the way heat does. The bunks caught it, warm air pooling around me. Scott was on the floor. The heat rose past him. I could see him adjusting, pulling his bag tighter, shifting closer to the stove. The floor was log over dirt, and the cold came up. The whiteout screamed against the walls. The cabin changed the sound. The wind came through the front wall as a whistle, hit the shutters and rattled. And through the nailed door, it made a sound I couldn't name. Low, almost beneath hearing, a resonance like blowing across the mouth of a bottle. Below me, Scott shifted, adjusted, shifted again. I almost offered to rotate, my bunk for his floor, switch at midnight. I should have. I opened my mouth and didn't say it, because I was warm and tired, and Scott had volunteered. I fell asleep. Scott didn't. I woke to the sound of Mike trying to open the front door. The snow had drifted against the cabin overnight and packed itself into a wall that reached this chest. Beyond it, nothing. Just white. The trees that had been 30 feet from the cabin were gone, swallowed by the blankness, so total it looked solid. The wind had dropped to something steady and low, which was worse than the gusting. The gust had edges. This was a constant, a pressure that didn't let up. Mike leaned out for a few seconds, then pulled back in and closed the door without saying anything. 15 feet of visibility. Nobody was walking out today. Scott was sitting against the wall near the stove, trying to stretch his back. He'd rolled up his sleeping bag with his usual neatness, but the deliberation was covering for something. Stiff. He kept reaching around to press the heel of his hand into his lower back, repeating the gesture without seeming to notice. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine." He hadn't slept. I'd heard him shifting through most of the night, nylon on wood every 20 to 30 minutes. The floor had beaten him. He stood up to prove he was fine, and the motion caught halfway. He put his hand on the wall and finished standing in 2 stages. Mike and I caught each other's eyes over his head. The conversation was short. He can't do that again. We had food for 4 days if we were careful. Water wasn't a problem. We could melt snow. Firewood was deep. We weren't in danger. We were stuck. And one of us was going to be in pain for every night of it. Mike brought it up first. He usually did. I'd think around the edges of a problem, and Mike would walk to the center. "What about the other room?" He nodded at the nailed door. In the grey daylight, the nails looked more deliberate than I'd registered the night before. Framing nails, 3 inches long, driven through the door frame into the door, countersunk with force. 6 of them, evenly spaced. "Might be another bunk," Mike said. "Storage at least." The logbook entries were in my head. Don't open it, close, shut. But in the light of a snowbound morning, they sounded like what they probably were. Close the flue, shut the door when you leave. Shut is only frightening if you don't know what it refers to. But my body didn't like the door. There was a tightness between my shoulder blades when I looked at it, a reluctance in my hands. I looked at Scott. He was pressing his thumbs into the muscles along his spine, jaw set in a way that meant he was managing something he wouldn't mention. Another night on that floor, and he'd be moving at half speed. 2 more, and he'd be a liability on the hike out. "Yeah," I said. "Let's open it." Mike worked the pry bar on his multi-tool under each head, rocking it back and forth, the wood giving up each nail with a sound like a joint cracking. The nails were dark along the shaft. The wood around each hole was discolored, darker than the surrounding grain, soft in a way that good timber shouldn't be. The door swung inward easily, as if the hinges had been maintained. The room was smaller, maybe 8 by 10. No window, a single bunk against the far wall. A mattress, old and stained, but intact. A wooden shelf beside it, empty. The ceiling was lower, or felt lower. The room pressed down, and it was warm. That stopped me in the doorway. The main room was warm because we'd been running the stove for 12 hours. This room had been sealed, no heat source or connection to the stove. The air should have been the same temperature as outside. It wasn't. The warmth was close and held, like body heat under blankets. I felt it in my face and arms, and the temperature difference ran the wrong direction. There was a smell, faint, sweet, underneath the wood and dust. Sweet the way certain chemicals are. An almost familiar scent my brain kept reaching for and not finding. Scott stepped past me and sat on the bunk, testing the frame, pressing the mattress. It held. His shoulders dropped. "This is fine," he said. "This is good." I swept Mike's headlamp around the walls. Marks, scratches in the wood near the doorframe and the head of the bunk. Some looked deliberate, maybe words in something dark, but the beam flattened everything and the marks blurred into grain at any distance. I caught fragments near the doorframe. What might have been a date, something that could have been shut or could have been a shadow. The light was bad. The marks were old. Scott needed a bed, and here was a bed. The day passed. The whiteout held. We played cards, rationed food, checked the weather through the cracked door at intervals that grew further apart as the view refused to change. Scott spent most of the afternoon on the bunk, reading a paperback. He said his back was loosening up. He looked better. Colour returned, stiffness draining. A warm surface after a frozen floor. Of course he felt better. That night, Scott went to bed in the second room. The door between the rooms stayed open. Nobody suggested closing it. Scott's breathing settled in minutes, the long exhale of a body finding what it needed, then the flat rhythm of real sleep. He'd barely slept in 36 hours. Of course he dropped quickly. I lay in the dark, the stove ticking, the whiteout on the walls, Mike's breathing below me, the half-sleep of someone not worried enough to stay awake and not comfortable enough to go under. I was almost out when I heard Scott's voice. Low, barely there, a murmur from the dark rectangle of the doorway. Scott talked in his sleep. I'd shared enough tense with him to know this. Short bursts of garbled syllables that dissolved before they became words. Normal. This wasn't that. The cadence was wrong. Sleep talk is fragmented, a half phrase, a mumble that trails off. What I heard was structured. He spoke for a few seconds, too quiet to separate into words, but continuous, the intonation of a complete thought. Then he stopped. A deliberate pause, one you'd leave when you'd said something and you're waiting for a response. Then he spoke again, another few seconds, another pause. One side of a conversation, the gap shaped exactly like the space another voice would fill, as if whoever he was talking to took the same time to respond every time. It didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like a phone call with someone patient on the other end. I held still, gripping the bunk frame without deciding to. Below me, Mike hadn't stirred. 5 minutes, maybe longer. I couldn't make out a single word. Whatever Scott was saying, it wasn't meant for me. Then it stopped, mid-pause, as if the other end had said something final. His breathing leveled back to deep sleep. I stared at the open doorway. The darkness in the second room was complete. No stove glow reached it. A black rectangle. People talk in their sleep. Cadence is a trick the ears play when it wants pattern. Scott was already up when I woke, standing by the stove, heating water for coffee, moving with an ease that didn't match the man I'd watched struggle to his feet the morning before. The stiffness was gone. He turned when he heard me shift in the bunk, and his face was rested, the way you look on the first morning of a trip. "You were chatting away in there last night," I said. "Keep it light," a tone you'd use for a joke. Scott laughed. "Was I? What was I saying?" "Couldn't make it out. Sounded like you were on the phone with someone." "Probably ordering pizza. My subconscious knows what it wants." Mike, pulling on his boots on the lower bunk, hadn't heard anything. Mike slept heavier than either of us. He shrugged and asked if the water was ready. I let it go. Scott didn't remember dreaming. The whiteout held. I pushed the front door open against the drift, and the snow had climbed another 6 inches overnight. The world beyond was the same white void. The trees reduced to grey suggestions at the edge of visibility. I went out to check the chimney. The snow on the roof was building. Another day of this, and I'd need to clear it or risk the weight compressing the stovepipe. I knocked what I could reach with the back of the axe from the woodshed and went back inside with snow in my collar and nothing new to report. While Scott and Mike played cards at the table, I went into the second room with my phone torch. The marks I'd seen before resolved in the directed light. Writing, different hands, different implements, layered over months or years. Some of it was scratched into the wood with a knife point or a nail. Some was written in ink, dark brown, the letters careful and small. Dates, tallies, groups of vertical lines in fives. short notations I couldn't pass. Near the doorframe, in letters carved deep enough to hold shadow even in flat light. Nail it shut when you leave. I moved the beam slowly across the walls. Most of the writing was fragmentary, a date with no context, a number with no reference, initials that meant nothing to me. Then I put the mattress back where it had been and left the room. The afternoon was long. The whiteout pressed on the windows like something leaning its weight into the glass. I did the math on food and firewood. We were fine for now. 2 more days, maybe 3, before fine became marginal. The trail out would be brutal in deep snow. We'd need our strength, which meant eating properly, would shorten the window. The storm had to break soon. The forecasts before we'd lost signal had called for 3 days. This was day 2 in the cabin. 1 more night, and we might wake to clear sky. Scott went to the second room early that evening. He didn't announce it, just picked up his book and headlamp and drifted through the doorway without ceremony. I watched him settle onto the bunk. He arranged his things on the shelf, pulled his sleeping bag up, and opened the paperback. I'd been in this cabin for days, and I still felt like a guest. The walls didn't know me. The space resisted me, the way unfamiliar places do. Scott looked like he belonged in that room, like the room had been waiting for him to come back. I didn't sleep. I lay in my bunk with my eyes open, watched the dark doorway, and waited. Mike's breathing slowed beneath me. An hour after Scott's breathing settled, the talking started. Same structured pauses, but louder. Not by much. The words were almost there. Almost. Right at the boundary where sound becomes language. I held my breath, strained. A word surfaced, or almost surfaced, and sank back before I could hold it. Then another. I was sure for a moment that he said a name. Then I wasn't sure. Then something new. In the pauses, the gaps where Scott seemed to be listening, I heard a second sound. A resonance. Low, felt as much as heard. It came from the walls, from the shared wall between the main room and the second room, a vibration that existed in the range of human voice, but wasn't one. The cabin was producing a frequency, responding. The gaps in Scott's conversations weren't empty. They were filled with something I could only hear because I'd stopped breathing to listen. The room was answering him. I got up, slowly, careful to keep my weight off the parts of the bunk frame that creaked. I crossed to the doorway of the second room and stood at the threshold. Scott was on his back, eyes closed, mouth moving. The words were clearer from 3 feet away, but still not language I could grab. Maybe not language at all. Sound shaped like speech, but he was participating. His face had the expression of someone engaged, present in a dialogue that was happening somewhere I couldn't follow. The resonance stopped the moment I stepped into the doorway, cut off cleanly. Scott's mouth stopped moving. His breathing shifted mid-cycle back to the flat rhythm of deep sleep. The room was silent. I stood there for a long time, the warmth pressed against me. It was stronger than the night before. I was almost certain of it, except there was no reason for the temperature to have changed. I went back to my bunk. I waited for the talking to start again. It didn't. Not while I was listening. Scott was different. He ate breakfast with us, he talked, he was present. but his presence had a direction to it now. A lean, like a compass needle that looks still until you notice it's always pointing the same direction. When he sat at the table, his body was angled toward the second room. When he got up to refill his coffee, he passed the doorway and slowed, a half step, barely perceptible. I watched him stand in the second room doorway for 10 seconds, looking in. Not doing anything, just standing. Then he came back to the table and picked up his cards. I told Mike everything while Scott was outside clearing snow from the chimney. The wall writing, the resonance in the walls the night before, the cabin answering Scott's voice with a frequency that wasn't sound but wasn't silence. Mike listened the way he always did. His first response was practical. So we closed the door and he sleeps out here tonight. I agreed. We'd frame it as a rotation, fairness. Nobody had to say the word wrong out loud. Scott came back in with snow on his shoulders and we told him. He resisted, and the resistance was the thing that scared me. He heard us out with the calm of someone who'd expected the conversation and prepared for it. He said he was comfortable in there, he'd been sleeping well. Why change what worked? Mike pushed, and Scott's calm cracked. There and gone. It's my room, he said. He didn't say my bunk. My room. Possessive in a way that didn't fit so few nights of occupancy. He heard himself say it. Something surfaced behind his eyes. A confusion, the look of a man catching himself in a sentence he didn't plan. He agreed to sleep in the main room. The moment closed over itself like water. We shut the second room door. I put Scott in the top bunk. I took the floor. One bad night to keep Scott out of that room. I positioned myself between the bunks and the door. If Scott got up, he'd have to step over me. The whiteout was at its worst. The wind had found a register that turned the cabin into an instrument. A low, constant moan that vibrated the shutters and hummed in the stovepipe. It made the walls feel thinner than they were. The stove struggled. Downdrafts pushed the smoke into the room, and I adjusted the flue. It helped, and then it didn't. The temperature inside dropped. The storm was compressing us, tightening the space, reducing the world to this room. Scott couldn't sleep. I heard him shifting, sitting up, lying down. After an hour, he said, quietly, I can hear it through the walls. Hear what? Someone talking in the room. Low. Can't you hear it? I listened. Nothing from the second room. There's no one in there, Scott. He didn't argue. He lay back down. I watched this silhouette in the stove light, on his side, facing the wall. The second room through 6 inches of log. His hand was flat against the wood, palm pressed into it. He lay like that for a long time. Then he got up and went to the second room door. I told him to leave it. He put his hand on the wood. The door itself, palm flat, fingers spread. His head tilted, listening. He said a name, a woman's name, not someone I knew. I saw Mike sit up in the dark, saw the confusion on his face. Scott said the name the way you'd say it to someone you'd expect to answer, soft and familiar. Scott, come away from the door. He turned and looked at us. His face in the stovelight was confused, like he'd woken up mid-dream, still half in the other place. She's been in there the whole time, he said. I don't know why you can't hear her. I got up and moved him back to the bunk. He didn't resist, but his body was heavy with reluctance, leaning toward the door the way a current pulls. We sat with him. He calmed. After a while, he said, "I think I was dreaming. I think I was still asleep." He said it carefully, like someone testing whether the words were true by hearing them out loud. Mike looked at me across the dark. I shook my head. "Don't push it. Let him sleep," was what I was trying to convey. Scott lay down. His sleep, when it came, was thin and restless, his body twitching toward the wall every few minutes, a slow, unconscious migration that I corrected twice by touching his shoulder. I sat with my back against the second room door. The floor was cold and hard beneath me, the same cold that had broken Scott's first night, and I understood now what I'd done by not offering him the bunk. I'd put him on this floor, which had driven him into that room that had started its work. Every decision I'd made, the route, the cabin, the silence when I should have spoken, was a step in a sequence that ended here, with my back against the door that shouldn't be warm. Because it was warm, against my spine, through my jacket and my base layer, from a room with no heat source, no insulation, no logical reason. I could feel it along my whole back, steady and close, and I didn't move, because moving meant letting Scott closer to it. 3 in the morning, maybe later, I was watching the door handle from my position on the floor, 6 inches from my face. The stove had burned to embers, the cabin was nearly dark. The handle moved. It depressed by degrees, as if a hand on the other side was pressing it down with the care of someone trying not to make noise. I watched it travel its full arc, the latch clicking free of the striking plate, the mechanism completing its function. The door pushed against my back, gently, testing my weight. I braced. It pushed again, slightly harder, and I leaned into it and held. The pushing stopped. From behind the door, through the wood, against the back of my skull, a voice. A woman's voice, muffled by the logs, but clear enough in its shape. Scott's name, said the way you'd call someone to bed, warm and inviting. She said it again, as if she knew the door would open eventually, and waiting was part of the conversation. I looked at Scott. He was asleep, but he was smiling, the wrong kind of smile. Mike was awake. I could see his eyes in the dark, watching me, watching the door. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We both understood. My weight could hold the door, but if Scott woke up and decided to move me, to the voice that was calling his name with a patience that felt like certainty, we could fight him. We could hold him down, but we couldn't do it forever. And whatever was behind that door could wait longer than we could stay awake. I sat against the door for the rest of the night, the warmth soaked through my back, into my muscles and bones. Twice more the handle moved, twice more the voice said his name. Each time, Scott smiled in his sleep. I don't know when I fell asleep. I know I didn't mean to. It was 4, maybe 5 in the morning. My eyes were open. Then they weren't. Minutes, maybe more. I snapped awake to a sound I knew. The crack of a nail being driven into wood. The door behind me was gone, open. The crack of a nail being driven into wood. I was on the floor where the door had been, and the door was closed. The sound was coming from the other side. I scrambled up. The main room was grey with early light. Mike was sitting up in his bunk, face white. The nails. I looked at the table. The 6 nails Mike had pulled from the frame, the ones we'd left in a row on the table surface. Gone. Another crack, the sound of steel sinking into hardwood, driven hard. Then another. I pressed my hands to the door and felt each impact through the wood. 6 nails being hammered back into the wood where they came from. I threw myself against the door. It was already solid. 3 nails in, and the door was part of the frame again, locked flush. Mike was beside me. We hit together. The wood didn't flex. Whatever was on the other side wasn't just nailed. It was set, bonded to the timber, as if they'd been there for years. The hammering stopped. 6 nails. I pressed my ear to the door. Scott's voice, clear, not the half-audible cadence of sleep talk, speaking at a conversational volume in a tone I recognized from 15 years of friendship. The voice he used sitting across a table from someone he was glad to see. Warm, easy. The voice of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He was talking to someone. The pauses were there, the same structured gaps. Fragments reached me through the wood. I caught my name once. He said it in the middle of a sentence, casually. He was telling her about me. "Scott?" I hit the door with my palm. "Scott, open the door." The talking continued. He hadn't heard me. Or he had, and it didn't register. Or it registered, and it didn't matter. Mike and I stood there. The grey light grew. The cabin was cold, except the door, which still radiated warmth into my palm like a living thing. On the other side, Scott talked. And in the gaps where he listened, I heard nothing. A space shaped exactly like a response, and Scott hearing something in it that I couldn't. And smiling. I was sure he was smiling. I could see it through the window. The whiteout was thinning. Visibility opened in stages, 50 feet, then 70, the tree line materializing, dark and definite against the white. The sky above the peaks had a brightness to it that wasn't cloud. In hours, maybe less, we could walk out. Scott was behind the door. We tried everything. I talked to him until my voice cracked. His name, our names, memories I pulled from 15 years of friendship. And we threw ourselves at the wood like we could pass through it. Mike had shouted, reasoned, threatened. We'd hit the door with our shoulders. The door didn't flex. The nails held it the way the original nails had. We might as well have been hitting the wall. Scott's voice was still there. We could hear it through the wood, the murmur of conversation. When I pressed my ear to the door, I caught fragments. Laughter once, the voice of a man with nowhere else to be. I needed to do something that wasn't standing in the main room listening to my friend talk to nothing through a door I couldn't open. "I'm going outside," I said. "The room has to have an exterior wall, a window we missed, something." Mike didn't look up. "I'll keep working this." Outside, the cold was sharp, but the wind had lost its force. I could stand upright without bracing. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts and knee-deep on the packed ground near the cabin walls. The sky was a pale grey that was almost white but had light behind it, the first suggestion in 4 days that the sun still existed. I started at the front door and went left, trailing my hand along the logs. The cabin wall was solid under my fingers. Squared logs chinked with something dark, the construction tight. Front wall, the door I'd come through, the 2 shuttered windows. I counted my paces. 14 feet. I rounded the corner. Side wall, solid, with no window or gap. The logs ran unbroken from the front corner to the back corner of the cabin. I counted my paces again. 20 feet. The main room was roughly 14 by 20. I could see it in my head. The stove on the left wall, the bunks on the right, the table in the center. 20 feet was the depth of the main room. The second room was built against the back wall, extending the cabin's footprint further. Another 8 feet, maybe 10. The cabin from outside should be 28 to 30 feet deep. I rounded the corner and was met by the back wall. 20 feet. I'd measured 20 on the side wall, and here was the back corner. The wall ran from one side to the other, continuous, 14 feet across, matching the front. I walked it with my hand on the logs, pressing, feeling for a seam, a joint, any indication that the wall had been modified, added to. I stood in the snow with my hands on the cabin and tried to make it work. The room existed. I'd stood in it, felt the warmth. Scott was in it now, talking to someone, sitting on a bunk that was somewhere behind these logs. But from out here, the space between the interior door and the wall was nothing. The room had an inside with no outside, a door that opened into a space that the building didn't contain. I kept going. Along the wall, I stopped. A second door set into the wall, same construction as the interior door, plankwood, framed, hinged, and nailed shut. Heavy nails driven through the frame, countersunk, the same pattern, the same spacing. 6 nails. I pressed my ear to it. From the other side, Mike. The rhythmic scrape of his knife blade working against the nail heads, the small crack of wood splintering, his breathing effortful and close. He was right there, inches away, working the interior door from the inside, while I stood at this door on the outside. This was the same door. I pressed my palms flat to the wood. The interior door, the one Scott had nailed shut from the inside. They were the same door. They were the same object seen from 2 sides that shouldn't both exist, and the room between them occupied a space that had no physical dimension. Scott was in that place, in the nothing between one side of a door and the other. I knocked hard with my fist. "Mike?" The scraping stopped, a pause, then his voice muffled by wood. "I can hear you. Where are you? Did you find a way in?" "Outside, Mike. This is the same door." Silence. Then I heard him press against the wood, the creak of weight against the planks, his hands flat on the surface the way mine were. "That's not possible," he said. But he said it the way you say something you already know is true, not naming the impossibility so he could move past it. I went back inside. Mike was standing at the interior door with his hands at his sides, his face the color of the snow outside. I told him what I found. I said it simply because there was no complex way to say it. The room doesn't exist from the outside. The cabin is one room. The door goes nowhere. He sat down on the bunk. He looked at the door and didn't argue, just accepted it with a grim arrival of something already suspected. The fight went out of him in a way I didn't like. His shoulders dropped, and he looked at the nailed door with an expression that wasn't grief. It was recognition. The look of a man understanding that the problem he's been trying to solve doesn't have a solution, because the problem doesn't operate in a space where solutions exist. The murmur continued behind the door, Scott's voice soft, but quieter now, quieter than it had been an hour ago, fading, like he was moving away from the door, further into a room that had no further to go, receding into a depth that couldn't exist in a space with no dimension. The words lost their edges, the pauses between them lengthened. The conversation was still happening, just further away, in a place that was pulling back from the door like a tide retreating, taking Scott with it. I sat down across from Mike. The stove was dead, the cabin was cold. Through the window, I could see sky. Actual sky. The first clear sky in 4 days. The peaks were visible. The trail was out there. We could walk out right now, pack our bags, open the front door, and walk 11 miles to the trailhead, back to a world where rooms had walls and doors opened under spaces that existed. Scott's voice came through the door, almost not there. A murmur from somewhere that shouldn't be anywhere, getting further away. And we couldn't follow. We didn't leave. We didn't leave because Scott was behind the door, and leaving meant leaving him there. Mike went back to the nails. He'd been working them for hours, and the first one was almost free. The wood around it chewed to pulp, the nail exposed enough to hook the pry bar under. He worked it with a patience that was its own kind of desperation, the focus of a man who couldn't afford to think about what he'd do when the door opened. The first nail came out. The shaft was wet, with something that had the colour of old tea and the smell of the room. The sweet chemical smell, concentrated, coming off the nail like perfume. The wood around the hole was dark and soft. When Mike touched it, his finger sank in past the first knuckle. He wiped the nail in his jacket and didn't look at it again. Second nail, faster now that he had the technique. Blade under, lever, rock, pull. The wood gave it up with a sucking sound. Same wetness and same smell. I put the nails on the table beside the logbook and tried not to notice that they were warm. Scott's voice had been fading since dawn. By mid-morning, it was barely there. The words lost their definition first, then the cadence. By midday, I could press my ear to the door and hear something that might have been a voice or might have been my own blood in my ear. The conversation was still happening, somewhere, but the somewhere was still pulling away from us, retreating into whatever space the room occupied, and Scott was going with it. Then, it stopped. I had my ear to the door when it happened. One moment there was something, the ghost of a voice at the bottom of perception. The next moment, there was nothing. And the nothing was wrong. When you press your ear to a closed door, you hear the room on the other side. You hear the ambient hum of a space, the micro sounds of temperature, the wood settling. Even an empty room has a sound. What I heard through the door was the absence of sound, void. I might as well have been pressing my ear to the outside of a submarine hull. There was no room on the other side of the door. There was nothing on the other side of the door. "He's gone," I said. I didn't mean to say it. It came out the way the truth sometimes does, the mouth reporting what the brain already knows. Mike didn't stop. Third nail, fourth. His hands were bleeding. The knife had slipped twice, opening the skin between his thumb and forefinger. He'd wrapped his palm in a sock and kept going. The blood soaked through the fabric, and he just adjusted his grip. The nail came free, and the blood on the nail was indistinguishable from the wetness already on it. I put my hand on the door. For the first time since we'd opened it, the door was cold. The same dead temperature as the exterior walls, the same lifeless wood. The warmth that had been radiating from the second room since the first moment we'd swung the door open was gone. Whatever had been generating it had stopped. Or finished. Fifth nail. Mike was making sounds with each pull now, grunts of a body working past what it should. The last nail resisted, sunk deeper than the others, or the wood had swollen around it. He hammered the knife handle with his bleeding palm, trying to force the blade into the gap between the nail head and the frame. The wood cracked, the blade slipped. He repositioned and tried again. The nail moved. A quarter inch. He rocked it. Another quarter. The wood released it with a sound that was too much like a sigh, and Mike threw the nail on the floor and grabbed the door handle. The door swung open. I was standing behind Mike. I saw it over his shoulder. For less than a second, a fraction, too short for thought, but long enough for perception. I was looking at the main room of the cabin. The stove, the bunks, our gear on the floor, seen from the wrong angle, from a perspective that shouldn't exist, as if the doorway were a window set into the back wall, showing the room from outside itself. I could see us, two men standing at an open door, seen from behind, from a vantage point that was inside the wall. The image was clear and impossible. Then it collapsed. Folded is the closest word, like how a reflection folds when you change the angle of a mirror, and it was just another door to the outside. My footprints from earlier still faintly settled into the ground outside. I reached past Mike and reached through the door frame. My fingers met the cold air. Scott was gone. His pack was gone. The bunk, the shelf, the mattress, the writing on the walls. All of it gone. Mike reached into the doorframe, felt what I felt, pulled his hand back, and sat down on the floor. He sat there for a while. I stood in the doorway and looked at the snow. I went outside through the main door. The snow was blinding in the clean air. The sun had broken through fully, and the light off the white was hard enough to squint against. I walked to the back wall where the exterior door was. I knew what I'd find. The doorway open, Mike sat on the other side. And that's exactly what I saw. There was no denying what had happened. Looking outside, we could see the trail, the tree line, everything. We were in a one-room cabin in a clearing in the Beartooth Mountains, and the cabin was ordinary now, but our friend was gone. I don't know how long we stood there, long enough for the silence to become its own thing, the weight of two people in a room with nothing left to try. Mike's hands were bleeding onto the floor, my legs ached from the cold. The logbook sat on the table with its pencil beside it. The nails sat on the table beside the logbook, 6 of them in a row, wet, dark, and still warm. I picked up the nails. I went to the door, still swinging, opening to the outside world. I closed it. The door met the frame flush. I picked up the axe, placed the first nail against the frame, and drove it in with the back of the axe head. The wood accepted it easily. The old hole was still there, waiting. The nail sank into its head in 2 strikes. I placed the second, drove it, third, fourth. The sound of each strike filled the cabin, 5th, 6th. I nailed the door shut, the same holes in the same pattern, because someone before me had done the same thing, had stood where I was standing, holding the nails, having lost someone through the same door, and had done this because it was the only thing the cabin gave you to do. The writing on the wall, the logbook entries, the warnings, they weren't left by people who understood what was happening. They were left by people like me, standing in a 1-room cabin with a door that went nowhere, doing the only thing they could think of, which was to nail it shut and leave a word for the next person. I opened the logbook, turned to the last page with writing, the page with "Don't open it" and "Close and shut," and I found the next blank line. I didn't write our names. I wrote the date, and beneath it, 1 word: shut. We packed. Mike moved mechanically. I packed my own gear. We walked out into the sun. The snow was deep and the going was slow. Neither of us spoke. The cabin sat behind us in its clearing, small and dark against the white. And I didn't look back, because I was afraid it would look exactly like what it was. An ordinary cabin, so normal that nothing about it suggested anything had ever gone wrong there. At all. Search and rescue found the cabin on the 2nd day. They searched the area for 5 days. Dogs, helicopter, grid patterns expanding from the cabin in every direction. Nothing. The snow had fallen for 4 days straight, and anything on the surface was buried. Anything beneath the surface was deeper than the dogs could reach. The terrain was steep, and the snowpack was unstable. On the 5th day, the team had called it. Scott was classified as missing, presumed dead. Exposure and disorientation, separated from his group during a whiteout, wandered off route, succumbed to the cold. Body unrecovered. It happens in the Beartooths. The mountains keep people sometimes. The reports are filed and the searches end. The person becomes a name on a list that nobody reads. I gave a statement. We sheltered in the cabin during the storm. Scott became disoriented. He left the cabin during the night. We searched and couldn't find him. We waited until the storm broke, hiked out and called for help. Every sentence was accurate. Every sentence was a lie. The truth was a room that didn't exist, a door that opened onto nothing, a voice through the wood that faded until it was gone. None of that could go in a report. None of that had a form you could file. Mike and I didn't talk about it. Not a decision we made, but an inability we discovered. I called him once, about a month later. He answered. We talked for 4 minutes about weather, work, and a football game neither of us had watched. Neither of us said Scott's name, nor said cabin or door or room. The conversation had a careful shape of 2 people walking through a space full of things they couldn't touch, navigating by absence. We hung up. I haven't called again. I think he's grateful. I looked for the cabin. Not in the mountains. I'm never going back to those mountains. Online. I pulled up every topo map of the Beartooths I could find, every USGS survey, every satellite image. The dot was there on my original map, the one I'd used to plan the route. Unlabeled, a small square at the edge of the tree line on the leeward side of the ridge. Precise enough to have coordinates, anonymous enough to have no name. I searched Forest Service databases, permit records, historical surveys. Nothing. No record of a structure at those coordinates. No record of a structure anywhere near those coordinates. I found one thing. A post on a hiking forum from 2011. Low traffic, 12 views and 2 replies. Someone asking about a cabin in the Beartooths that wasn't on any map. 1 room, a stove, a logbook, a door on the far wall nailed shut. The poster was asking if anyone knew who maintained it. The first reply said it was probably an old mining shelter. The second said they'd hiked that area for 15 years and there was no cabin. The poster never responded. I read the post 3 times. I didn't reply. I don't know what I would have said. I was there. I found it. I opened the door you're asking about. My friend went through it and didn't come back. What would that do? What would that change? The post was 15 years old. The person who wrote it had been there, the same as me. Maybe they'd lost someone too. Maybe they'd nailed the door and written in the logbook, walked out with a weight they couldn't put down. Or maybe they'd been lucky, and they were just curious, and their curiosity was the kind that stays online and doesn't drive you back up the mountains with a pry bar. The truth is, there is no ending. Nothing followed me home. The cabin isn't reaching for me. I don't hear voices through my walls. I don't feel warmth where warmth shouldn't be. It doesn't pursue. It just sits there, in the mountains, in a cabin that's on no map, but was on my map, the one I'd planned the trip on. It sits there with its nailed door, and the storm season comes every year. Hikers come every year, and some of them get caught out, need shelter, and the cabin is there. I can only hope that whoever finds it is smaller than a group of 3.